drunk. Believe me, sir, I much prefer the classic battle of him and her. I don't like quiet and I wish I were in love
Softly, I will leave you softly, for my heart would break if you should wake and see me go. So I leave you softly, long before you miss me, long before your arms beg me to stay for one more hour or one more day. After all the years, I can't bear the tears to fall so softly as I leave you
Good evening, and welcome to the meeting of the Board of Education on December 19th, in case you were not sure what the date was. Can we have the roll call first, please?
Mrs. Blanks?
Here.
Dr. Greenberg?
Here.
Mr. Levine?
Here.
Mr. Paul Uke?
Here.
Ms. Poland?
Here.
Dr. Thomas Farkason?
Here.
Mr. Zdanowitz?
Here.
Student Representatives Grace Andrews?
Here.
And Maddie Pliskin?
Here. Thank you. Maddie, are you up? Oh, I've not gotten it right yet.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, there's no revision to the agenda order, and so we're going to move straight to the highlight of our evening, which is the Sedgwick Sounds, under the direction of Jenna Valliere.
everyone, good evening. My name is Jenna Valier. I'm the director of Sedgwick Sounds. These kids are a group of 7th and 8th graders, our select singers over at Sedgwick Middle School. We have 2 songs for you tonight, and I'm going to let the kids introduce them. We have a couple of kids that wrote a little bit of background information about each song, so I'm going to let them do all the introductions. Come on up, Tommy. There you go.
Winter Wonderland was composed by Felix Bernard in 1934. Winter Wonderland is usually sung when caroling during the holiday season. Since it's nearing the holidays, our group decided to sing it. One of the obstacles that we faced was finding an arrangement to fit a 4-part choir. So we decided to arrange it ourselves. When arranging, one must think about harmonizing and what parts fit together. But luckily for us, we had the help of Marlena and Sophia Piccolo. And now, Winter Wonderland, newly arranged by Sedgwick Middle School Sounds in 2017.
Sleigh bells ring, are you listening? In the lane, snow is glistening. A beautiful sight, we're happy tonight, walking in a winter wonderland. Gone away is the bluebird, here to stay is the new bird. He sings a love song as we go along, walking in a winter wonderland. In the meadow we can build a snowman and pretend that he is Parson Brown. He'll say, are you married? We'll say, no, man. But you can do the job when you're in town. Later on, we can spy as we dream by the fire to face unafraid the plans that we made, walking in a winter wonderland. In the meadow we can build a snowman and pretend that he's a circus clown. We'll have lots of fun with Mr. Snowman until the other kitties knock him down. Let it snow, ain't it thrilling? How your nose gets a chillin'. We'll frolic and play the Eskimo way, walking in a winter wonderland. Walking in a winter wonderland. Walking in a winter wonderland.
So just a side note, that as Tommy explained, the kids arranged that themselves. They wrote the harmonies, they wrote the bass line, they wanted to do the remix with stomping and clapping, so that all came from them with the help of Sophia and Marlena. But they did that all themselves, which is really impressive. Our second song, I'm going to let Shelby come up and introduce to you.
And Gabby.
Shelby and Gabby, sorry.
Hi, I'm Shelby.
And I'm Gabby.
We are in 8th grade.
Our next piece is called Amavolo Volo. In this song, we worked very hard towards mastering our blend.
We also worked on our pronunciation. In this piece, because it's in another language, we want to showcase this song in its language well.
This is a song about the people of South Africa who were afraid to go to a place called KwaMashu.
KwaMashu is a town that had a large amount of violence.
This song was sang in hope to escape the violence and go back to KwaMashu.
Nowadays, the violence is a lot less, but the song has become more familiar and is still sang in celebrations. Now, please sit back and enjoy Amavolo Volo.
Si sabama volo volo
Thank you so much. For any parents who got caught behind the group and want to come in front and take pictures, shall we hold them in place? You want to come around and take a picture? Is anybody left back there?
All right, one more time.
So,
From the top.
that's right. I just have to say, you guys said you were a singing group, but a cappella, singing, dancing, chanting, drumming, arranging, that's something I couldn't do when I'm a grown-up. So that was fabulous. Thank you all so much. And happy holidays.
Oliver, you go first.
Thank you again. That was great. I love the holidays, these performances. It's amazing. Okay, I didn't see anyone signed up to say anything, but is there anybody who wants to make a public comment? Other than how fabulous you are? Okay, then we have no unfinished business. We have no new business. And we're on to staff communications and reports, beginning with our beloved superintendent.
Thank you. And thank you to Jenna and Cedric Sounds. What a wonderful way to kick off what's closing in on soon-to-be December break for people. And a few really good news. Oh, yeah, that's why. A few good news announcements that have come in. I want to thank first the Foundation for West Hartford Public Schools, which last week during our leadership meeting where we have all the principals in, they came in and to celebrate their 20th anniversary, having donated well over $1 million back to our schools. They came in with one of those big checks, which I've always wanted, and donated $20,000 to our schools to celebrate. So each principal got a check for $1,250, and they'll meet with their staffs to decide how to spend it to fulfill the mission of West Hartford Public Schools, which is to enrich the process. So if people are looking for something great to donate to at the end of this year, Foundation for West Hartford Public Schools always does great work, but our principals greatly appreciate the support this year especially. I want to congratulate Kathy Coghill from Hall, who has been asked to be a table leader for the 2018 AP Research reading. AP Research being one of the newer courses at the College Board and a hugely successful course nationally that is being added because it's part of the AP Capstone Diploma program. And I just remind you, West Hartford was selected as the only public school district in New England to pilot the program 4 years ago. So this has really been well received by our students in our schools, and graduating as a capstone scholar, which once you complete it, that's something you put on, is something that colleges certainly have looked kindly upon so far.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Just to say, your news suggests not only that West Hartford is a pioneer, but that she is a pioneer because a table leader, at least when I was a table leader, what you did was you set the standards for all of the essays and the whole exam. So that's a tremendous
It is. I'm glad you pointed that out.
honor for her
I'm glad
and
you
for
pointed
us.
that out. It's wonderful. And really, I should point out the thanks to all of our teachers and congratulations who are chosen as readers, because even that in and of itself is tremendous, and it's great professional development for them. Speaking of that kind of thing, Jennifer Hall, teacher at Morley, and Ashley Callan, our curriculum specialist with social studies that we saw, and we saw the book that Ashley worked on last summer, earlier this year we presented, were selected as 2 of 64 national panelists to participate in the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's the big national exam where schools are selected to measure, and then the nation's report card is based on the NAEP. It's given nationally. They were selected as 2 of the 64 to participate in grade 4 writing achievement level setting, which, just as you said with table reading, this supports the alignment of this national examination to make sure they're being scored properly, questions and to look at, okay, how are we scoring this? So tremendous achievement, great recognition for our teachers to be part of these national assessments. I want to point out this book and the Inspiring Equity exhibit that you can see all along the third floor. And you're going to want to download the program if you haven't been yet and use your phone to hear the stories, because this is about our West Hartford stories and our community and how we speak to each other and the different people that make up our community. And Thursday night and Saturday night was the opening of the exhibit, and they were both just tremendous night, banged out with people filling the hallways, listening, watching, celebrating in the town hall. Really just a great, great event. And I want to tip my cap to Rosina, Kerry Jones, just the work that went into this to organize it and to get this grant. Because remember, this all happened because of the grant that we celebrated last year that they had received. And just more example of the work that we're doing on equity having real meaning. So
And Michelle, who put it together.
Absolutely. Michelle Lacroix was the grant coordinator who ended up working and doing interviews. Yes. I want to mention last week schools celebrated Human Rights Day with activities that ranged from, I sent you a video about the UN that Charter Oak students had done, announcements at the schools, discussions, and a deliberation day at Conard. And I say that instead of a debate, but deliberation. What does that mean, and how is deliberation different than debate and discussion? And the question that they focused on was the right to an education. What is the 21st century mission for public schools? Great day, great discussion held at Conard. At Hall, they're going to be combining Human Rights Day with Do Something Week in January, a annual tradition at Hall, and we look forward to that at Hall. The Gap Fair, which is, I know, one of the things we discuss here because it's something people ask about. What if you're still wondering? And the USA Gap Fair, we are very proud to hold. It comes up and increases in attendance every year. That'll be at Conard Thursday, January 11th from 6 to 8:30 p.m. And it's a great opportunity for our students to see other opportunities if they're not sure yet what they want their path to be in life. So Thursday, January 11th, 6 to 8:30. And, I got a question about the impact of, I wanted to update you. I've been periodically during the year of displaced students in West Hartford from Puerto Rico. We're at, currently, actually, it's just at 10 now. We had 11. We have somebody going back now. And dispersed throughout our schools, so there's not one school that has all these in one classroom, all these kids and children that are our kids as they live in West Hartford now. So the impact has really been negligible, just as we always have students coming into the district. But we hope that they've found a good home here and been treated well as they've been here. So with that, I just wish for everyone to have a fantastic 2018, and I hope that it treats us a little better than 2017 did at times, particularly during budget season, and that really we can all have a peaceful and joyous year. So thank you.
Thank you. And now the multi-year enrollment projections. Mr. Chip Ward is going to give us his report.
This is something that I do want to point out as Chip comes up to the table. It's very unique in West Hartford. We have Chip Ward, and it's one of those things, what separates West Hartford from other districts. Chip is one of those things, and he wouldn't agree to that, but it's true, because other districts are spending thousands of dollars on these enrollment programs. There are companies that make their living based on this, and Chip does this every year, and it's not just a fantastic study of where we are, where we're going, but in the numbers, you can see the history of West Hartford and our schools. You can make comparisons to nationally and Connecticut, what's happening. So I'll turn it over to Chip.
Okay, well, Good evening, everybody. This is probably my 20th time I've done this now. It's been interesting. I'll just preview. This is the easy part of the cycle, and we'll talk a little bit about what cycle we're in. So you see here, this is the big picture of the enrollment trends in West Hartford since 1947. I don't know, about 8 or 10 years ago, I found like the history of all the enrollments from year to year. And the dark blue line indicates the absolute level of the enrollment, which started around 5,000 right after World War II, peaked at around almost 13,000 in the late 60s, and then the light purple line is the change. And I just want to point out, in the 1950s, which is 60 years ago, they were adding between 600 and 800 students every year. So that's like the equivalent of 2 elementary schools a year is what they were adding to the enrollment of the district. That obviously was a boom time. All the schools were built in West Hartford. And then you can see somewhere between 1959 and 1960, they were growing at 600 kids a year, and all of a sudden they stopped, and they started growing at around 100 kids a year. So they could catch up for a little bit. And then from around 1970 down to 1984, they dropped from a peak of around 13,000 to a nadir of around 7,000 students. And again, they were dropping at 400 or 500 students a year throughout the 1970s. And that was losing one elementary school, not growing by 2, but losing one elementary school a year. And that was a time of tremendous consolidation. We closed 2 middle schools, consolidated into King Philip and Sedgwick. We closed 3 or 4 elementary schools, sold one. I mean, it was got down to, I think, 9 or 8 elementary schools at the nadir. And then from 84 through 2009-10, we had a gradual increase, sort of the baby boom echo. You can the echo was just so easily seen there. And that was a relatively modest growth rate of 100 to 200 students per year. But because we didn't have facilities, we kept running into space crunches. And because we were only growing at like 200 a year instead of 400 a year, it wasn't really clear. So you just sort of kept, what you've seen over those 90s is we sort of added classrooms. Once we reopened Smith and went back up to 11 elementary schools, we started adding classrooms at all the schools. So we now have approximately 30 modulars at the various classrooms. And then you saw we peaked at around 2009, 2010, and we've been gradually declining, somewhere around 50 to 100 students per year since then. So that sort of gives you a history. And so now I want to talk about the mechanisms that how we do the enrollment projections. So the first thing we do is we start with the bursts. Because bursts are one of the biggest drivers of the enrollment in the district. And so you see on this chart, the purple line with the axis on the right is the total number of statewide bursts in Connecticut. And bursts in Connecticut peaked way back in 1989 at around 50,000 bursts per year, and have since slowly and steadily dropped, though more significantly dropping during the recessionary periods of the early 90s and then the 2008. To around 35,000. So dropping by almost a third over the 25, 30-year period. Whereas bursts in West Hartford followed a very different trajectory. At around 600 in 1990, they peaked around 720 somewhere in the early aughts, between 2001 and 2004. And then now they've been declining ever since that point in time. So they're back about where they were in 1990. So our births have held relatively constant while the states have dropped by a third. So again, it's an indication of the relative attractiveness of West Hartford as a district. So you start with the bursts, and then you apply what are called the cohort survival ratios. So what are the cohort survival ratios? Well, it's a pretty simple mathematical term. It's just the ratio of a cohort of students as they move from one grade level to the next. So in 2017, we had 660 second graders in our school district on October 1st. That compared to 645 first grade students in 2016. So the cohort survival ratio from grade 1 to grade 2 in that particular year was 1.0232. So we roughly had 2.3% more second graders than we had first graders. In 2017, this fall, we had 741 sixth graders compared to 761 fifth graders the last year. So in that case, the cohort survival ratio was less than 1. So 741 divided by 761 are about 0.9737. And then finally, I just point out that in 2017, we had 602 kindergarten students compared to 578 births 5 years ago in 2012. The births are the only time we really have a complete census of that cohort of students. The next time we get that census is when they enroll in kindergarten. So that cohort survival ratio is over a 5-year period is 602 divided by 578, which is about 1.0415. So what do these cohort survival ratios really account for? They account for the 4 major trends that impact the enrollment projection. First is families moving to West Hartford for the schools. And you'll see that in a cohort survival ratio that's greater than 1 in the early grade levels. Second, you have families choosing to send their students to private, parochial, or magnet schools. And you see that most typically at that 5th to 6th grade transition period, which is when most of the spaces open up in the private school sector, as well as when our instructional model shifts from the elementary to the middle school. This also incorporates all the changes that happen because of families coming to or leaving from West Hartford due to economic reasons. The Great Recession had a big impact, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then obviously it also incorporates the turnover in the real estate markets as new families move in and older families move out. So it's not perfect. It sort of suggests that history is going to continue along its path. But because we update it every year, we get the opportunity to adjust and reflect current trends. So the first cohort survival ratio I want to talk about is the birth to grade K cohort survival ratio. So this is that 5-year gap between births and to kindergarten 5 years later. And so you can see this shows the last 10 years worth of data, 2007 to 2017. So you see for most of the period, our cohort survival ratio in kindergarten is typically substantially above 1, except for, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Prior to 2014, we never had a year where the cohort survival ratio was less than 1. Well, I got 25 years worth of data. We never had a cohort survival year less than 1. Typically, we had a 1.05, anywhere from 1.06 to 1.15, averaging somewhere around an 8% increase. Then 2014, we had a 0.92 cohort survival ratio. 2015, we had a 0.992 as well in 2015. 2016, last year, increased to about 0.98, and then this year we were at about 1.04. So we spent, when this happened, we spent a lot of time, if you look back at the old reports from 2 years ago, looking at where did the kindergarten students go? Did we lose them to private schools? Did we lose them to magnet schools? And the data was clear. No, we didn't lose them. We have roughly the same percentage of kindergarten students as we've always had. They just left. And so that really was, 2009 was when, the market really crashed, and it was a very tough time. And I think young families exited the state of Connecticut, or they certainly, I can't talk about Connecticut, I don't have the statewide data, but certainly they exited West Hartford. But we've turned to more normal economic times. 2012 to 2017 is a more typical economic period, and we're back to our normal trend of around a 4% growth. Oh, sorry, and the, and then finally, the column on the right, base, is, so when I do my projections, I use a 3-year average, the most recent average of the 3 years. So that's the base, because we had 15, they'll average 15, 16, and 17. So it's about a 0.98. So I suspect it's probably going to be a little underestimating what the future numbers are going to be, but that's the methodology that I've used and I continue to use. So just to be aware of that. Then we take a look at figure 1, which was in your board report, and this is just the average cohort survival ratio over all the grade levels, birth to K, K to 1, all the way up to 11 through 12. And so you see in 2017, we had one of the highest ratios we've ever had in recent history, and I think one of the highest we've ever had at 1.015, which means that on average we had 1.5% more kids in the subsequent grade than we had in the previous grade. Good news story. We also, as part of this work, I also track the enrollments in the private schools and in the interdisciplinary magnet schools. So this really takes a look at the private school enrollment as a percentage of the total population. It looks at the leftmost bars are kindergarten, then grades 1 through 5, then grade 6, grades 7 and 8, and then high schools. And then on the far right-hand side is all grade levels, K through 12 combined. The green bar is 1996, and the purple bar is 2016, which is the most recent data that I've got. There, it's about a year behind on this data set. So you can see a substantial shift of the population from the private schools to the public schools. Other than at the high school level, it's about a 4 or 5% shift. High school has maintained its attractiveness at around 13% of the population. The other source of the data that has an impact on our enrollment is the number of West Hartford resident students who are enrolled in other public districts in the state of Connecticut. And this shows you the total enrollment, which was only 171 students in the 2008-2009 school year, grew steadily to 539 students in 14-15, and has been dropping off closer to 441 in 2017-2018. Approximately half of these students attend Hartford Public Schools, a third of them attend the Creek Interdistrict Magnet Schools, and 10% attend the Wittenberry School. We pay tuition to students who go to the Creek schools. We don't pay tuition to the students who go to the Hartford Public Schools or the Wittenberry schools. So when you factor in the birth rates, when you factor in all those cohort survival ratios that are detailed in great impact in the report, then we can make a projection over the next 10 years in terms of what the enrollment's going to be. And that's in that shaded bar on the right-hand side of the chart. It covers the period from 2018-2019 through 2027-2028. Essentially, you know, history is projected to sort of continue along its way. We've got a gradual decline in our enrollment, primarily as a reflection of lower births. You know, no longer do we have 700 births a year, we're down to 600 births a year. And as those births go through the year, currently they're in kindergarten through 3rd grade, 4th grade through 12th grade are the larger birth cohorts. The enrollments in the schools are going to gradually decline. Some years not by much. You know, next year it looks to be about a 30 student drop. Following other years, it could be 150 students in the out years. It just depends as different cohorts exit the system. But a gradual drop in the total enrollment from the current level of around 9,700 students to around 8,300 students about 10 years from now. When we take a look at the enrollment projections at the individual the different levels of the school, the red line at the top shows the elementary enrollments, which peaked 2010-2011 around 4,700 students. We're currently at around 4,100 students in our elementary schools, and we're projected to level off at around 3,700 students 5 or 6 years from now. And then beyond that, that's really determined by what the births are going to be. And I don't, you know, we can't project, we only have births through 2016 when we did this study. So it's tough to project much beyond 10 years. The next set of lines, the blue lines, is the high school enrollment. As the high school enrollments are relatively steady over the last 10 years at around 3,000 students to 3,100 students in our 2 high schools. It's projected to peak getting close to 3,200 students in the next couple of years as we've got some bubbles of students. We've got a very large 9th grade coming in next year. It'll be our largest cohort coming in. We've got a large 9th grade this year, and as those 2 grades go through, we've got one more coming in. I think about 3 years from now, we'll be sort of at our peak population. Then it's gradually going to decline as the overall smaller grade levels come through, down to around 2,800 in the out years. And then the bottom green line is the total middle school enrollment, which again has been relatively steady at 2,200 students throughout the last 10 years, but it's really now starting to begin to make a decline towards 2,000 in about 3 years, and then around 1,900 towards the end of the forecast period. So that gives you a little snapshot of the overall enrollment projections. Typically, in many years in the early 90s, or middle 90s, when I first started these things, it was always like, well, what school's running out of space? And you know, I don't have the charts here, but I mean, all the details in your revised packet. Sorry for skipping out on that on the first chart, but they're all there. There's no space needs at any of the schools. You know, particularly, you know, we've got plus with the whole science labs coming in, that will both improve the quality of instruction there, but also provide for adequate space at Hall High School as these numbers get larger towards the 2021 timeframe. So that's the quick summary of the enrollment projections. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. I just want to start myself by saying, first of all, this is the third year in a row I've asked. Cohort survival rate, could we just change that name? Just asking. It just creeps me out. Okay. The other question that I had, equally serious, is you just said you've been doing this for 20 years. If you look back at your projections, how accurate have they been? I don't mean you. I mean, how trustworthy are these trends if you look back?
I mean, they're, as mentioned in the report, they're the best 1 year out, and as you go farther out, they're less accurate. There's a detailed chart that shows the comparisons. The trend is going to be downward. There is no forecast, because it's really driven by the births. We had our last large cohort of births in 2004. They entered the school system as kindergarten students in 2009, and since then, it's going to gradually be dropping. We are it's not like this is Las Vegas, and you're building houses all over the place. There is no more room to add housing stock, so I don't have to somehow make a guess as to what the overall the number of houses are going to be. So we're relatively, there's been a lot of development of apartments, and I've done a detailed study of the apartments. One bedroom, we get 0.02 kids per every one bedroom apartment, 0.06 kids for every two bedroom apartment, and it's only when we get 3 bedroom units, either condos or apartments, that you start getting 0.9 kids per unit coming into the school system. So
I just meant actually your track record over time in the past 20 years.
It's sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong.
No pressure. Okay, serious questions now. Mark?
Yes, serious questions now, Jeff. Can you go back to the bar chart where you talk about your 3-year trend and where you measure 3 years?
Which one?
It's the one where we had the dips.
Like it was one of the first ones, right?
It was a bar chart.
Yeah.
Let's
go forward. One more. This one?
Yeah, and you saw your base, and you measured it on your last 3, and that's
Correct.
how you've always done it.
Yeah.
I get that, and I understand if you've always had the numbers, but because you articulated why you think 14, 15, and 16 were so low because of 2009 and the recession, and now that we're seeing an increase from 2016, 17, because these numbers ultimately get run into our budget, what our projections for budget is. So if we do the last 3 years with what we know about 2009, doesn't it make sense maybe to do a 10-year birth survival rate, because it'll smooth that number out for our budget when we come to that?
So a couple things. One is, right now I'm assuming a 0.98 cohort survival ratio. We got 700 kids, so I'm assuming we got 600 births. So 2%, we're going to end up with 588 kids. If it actually comes in at 1.01 instead of 578 kids, we're going to end up with 606. So it doesn't have a big impact 1 year. That type of number change from 0.98 to 1.02 would have a big impact over 6 years, but we have the opportunity over multiple years to make those corrections. So we're either going to have somewhere between 580 or 610 kindergartners coming into us next year. 30 different kindergartners spread over, we typically have 30 sections of kindergarten, is not going to have a significant impact on our budget for next year. If we maintain at 1.04 instead of at 1.98, yeah, that's going to have a bigger impact over multiple years. But the blessing is that while these numbers look substantially different, the impact is small on year 1. It's much more significant in year 6, and that's why I'm always wrong. I mean because I get a chance to make an estimate again. Estimating is the best job.
No, I know. I understand.
Everyone forgets your last year's. Well, now you've all forgotten what I said last year. Now we're just focusing on this year. So.
Other questions? Oh, please, Rob.
My kind of a comment that I want the fellow board member, I don't know if everyone's been thinking about this as you've been reviewing Chip's really good detailed analysis. Thank you for this. The first question that popped into my mind when I looked at his chart on enrollments and yearly changes in enrollment over time that went back to 47 and then projects forward was how the town reacted budgetarily. And so I think as a board, we have to think, and maybe it's to Mark's point a little bit too, that, what have we done in the past when we've seen not only the increases, as was mentioned by Chip, with adding lots of space as needed and whatnot, but as we go through periods of decline, like we did in the 70s and 80s, what did we do as a town? And granted, it's not exactly a perfect comparison situation because we're going through a slower decline, and it's not necessarily affecting the town in one specific area because, as he stated, the enrollments are smaller projected-wise. But I do think we should be concerned because when you look at the budget, I was able to get data from the last 20 years off the website. And as we all know, the budget's gone up dramatically. The biggest concern is that since we've leveled off at the beginning of the last decade, we've seen some of our biggest increases. And I know Chip's going to say, well, that's due to healthcare increases and contracted salaries. But my concern is going forward, what do we do as a board? What are we thinking about as far as solving this nut of, slow declines in enrollments, yet ever increasing budgets? At some point as a town, we're going to reach a tipping point. And to his point about one of the 4 tenets, I think that was one of your things about real estate, as a practitioner in that field, it's already out there, folks. There's already discussion, there's already people that they're aware of what the real estate impact is on their pocketbooks in this town, and as a decision, when they're comparing us to a Glastonbury or a Farmington or an Avon or any of those schools that we compete against, this is becoming more important to them than I've ever seen in my entire real estate career in the last few years. So while the declines might seem small and not necessarily a big impact to us in the immediate future, I think we need to be preparing and budgeting for it now and not 6 years from now, because this problem is only going to be greater when we look at these budgetary increases. I mean, in 2010, we had a budget of $126 million approximately, and then in this current year, we're at $159 in a period of slow declining enrollments. I just think as a board, we need to be already thinking about, okay, since that's what's being projected for the next, 5, 6, 7 years, what are we going to do to mitigate those types of things? And I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think, budgets are, a couple thoughts. One is, when you have increasing enrollments, you've got tremendous budgetary pressures. Budgetary pressures gets enhanced because you have to, in addition to having salaries go up, having benefit costs go up, you have to keep adding teachers to meet, and then teachers and then classrooms to meet the additional enrollment need. So when enrollments are declining, you have less budgetary pressure because you're going to have some types of natural declines. Like last year, we used 6 fewer elementary teachers this year than last year because we have fewer, while we're able to still maintain the same class size guidelines as you've done. But I think the important thing to recognize from a public policy perspective is because we're a people-intensive business, the only way to get productivity improve, the only way to cut, typically when you cut costs in a typical business environment, is you get productivity improvements. In other words, you produce more widgets with fewer people. Well, the corollary of productivity improvements in the education sector is fewer teachers and more kids, which is a higher class size. And that's certainly a policy area to take a look at, but I mean, it's something that's a challenging one for you guys to address as policymakers, and it's certainly, when you take a look at what's happening to the class sizes in our town relative to some of the surrounding towns, we are not certainly at the lowest class sizes.
I think Chip did a good job explaining. I do think it's important to note that this isn't a West Hartford phenomenon, which we've discussed. This is a statewide phenomenon of declining enrollment, and in fact, we have one of the lower rates of decline, especially compared to our neighboring communities, which have seen significant decreases and have often filled those declines, which has seen their increases in open choice students, whereas our open choice students, our numbers have increased, but the percentages haven't dramatically because we always had 150, 170, now 200 open choice students. So that's how they've kind of augmented their numbers from that decline. So you've seen other districts losing 13, 14, 17% of their students, whereas we're at 5% over those years. So West Hartford, I am comfortable with, is still competing directly with those towns too.
But I think, not to speak for you, Rob, but I think the question isn't whether we're doing better than other towns. The question is, why are our budgets rising when our population isn't? Right? And
Yeah, well, you have to be careful when you get caught in comparisons because, sometimes you look better compared to everybody else when everybody is on a sinking ship, right? It's like reassembling chairs on the Titanic, old analogy, right? So, again, I just think it's, as a board, we have to think hard on what we're going to do because you're right, the whole state is in a state of decline, but West Hartford's not immune to it, and we have to question why, not so much why, because we know a lot of the answers, I guess, but what we're going to do going forward when we're at nearly $160 million budget. So what are we going to continue to do to provide this amazing school system that we have while taming that number? And otherwise in 6 years, are we going to be at a $200 million budget? And so I think it's important to start thinking about it now and not waiting till March, to look at these numbers. Sometimes that's why I think a chart would be helpful because I think people like those type of graphical representations to say this is what we've looked at historically. It wouldn't hurt to compare us to other towns because I know we like to do that, but at the end of the day, we really just need to focus on West Hartford. And the problems are already here. What we went through, like what Tom was saying earlier with 2017 not being kind of a rocky year, if we think 18 is going to be better, we're fooling ourselves because we're already, $200 million in deficit as a state? So if we think we're not going to be facing problems come spring when they come back in session, we certainly are going to have additional problems. Our education grants could be on the chopping block in this town because everybody thinks we're so wealthy when we're really more diverse and more economically, socially diverse than a lot of people give us credit for. So it just as a board, I think we just need to, we need to hit the ground running. We need to figure out how we're going to go forward without increasing class sizes to an untenable number or doing other things like obviously cutting staff in places we don't want to cut staff. But we can't just hide behind those non-tenable solutions and say, well, that we're doing the best we can. We have to figure out a different path.
just to respond to you, this is exactly what we did last year and what we will do again this year, because you're so right. But my sense is that the reason that the numbers are going up is largely costs that we can't control, like special education, for example. We don't have any choices about this. So that, I mean, that's the problem, is these fixed costs, that there are state requirements that we're suddenly mandated to do, and that's what we have to look at. I mean, then that's exactly what we're going to do in the budget season, to say, okay, what do we not have an option to do, and what do we have an option to do? And that's what we did last year, and we'll keep doing it. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We have to talk about it. It's just not clear to me how we're going to get our hands around the whole $9 million or whatever it was.
Yeah, and just to segue off that, because I get this question all the time from the general public, if we see 100 decline in students, Johnny Public thinks that's 4 classrooms of 25, and it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. It's 100 over 9,700 kids, so there's not a ratio there, and I try to explain that. But it's good here for the public viewing to know that as well, the people watching, that, 100 students, there's no real ratio or relationship to, 4 teachers, if you will, or 4 classrooms of 25. That I kind of originally thought that when I first came on too. And so, I do my best out there trying to explain to those people that ask me about declining. And certainly we eliminated those teachers in elementary, middle school, and high school last year. So where those real numbers had to be met. So, but just for the people viewing and for edification, there's not a one-to-one.
I was going to ask, though, piggybacking on that, because we did have some fewer classrooms, and you had talked about the temporaries and whatever. Are there possibilities that we can close down some of those the temporary ones, at least the ones that are falling apart? Just as, is that one option?
Yeah, absolutely. So we take a look at those spaces, and you'll see that in the CIP. Unfortunately, it typically costs money to take those down. Classrooms space is always welcome at a school. So we're careful in how, and it's also, you spend money to put them up, you spend money to take them down, and then if you take them down, you need them again, so we are looking at expedited removal of classrooms where we really don't think the enrollment's ever going to justify them again, and where that they specifically don't work well with the existing school setting. Others work better than, some work better than others. Rayburn's had one since 1988, I think. It's been there almost 30 years.
I mean, in some schools like Whiting Lane, I think they're the only ones that are air conditioned, for example, so they're the popular ones.
Correct.
But anyway, I was just curious if that was an option. Any other questions? Rob? Okay.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much for your very thorough report. I'm so appreciative of your analytical mind. A question I have referencing what you stated in the report with respect to the 6th grade historically being the lowest with CSR. Just out of curiosity, is there any stats that are significant or even noteworthy of students that may have started off in a maybe private school or a parochial school and returned back to the public school?
We most typically see that at 9th grade. So the cohort survival ratio is typically under 1 from 5th to 6th and substantially above 1 from 8th to 9th. So there's a subset of kids who leave, go somewhere else for middle school, and then return for our high school.
Thank you.
Oh, interesting statistic about the ebb and flow. And I don't know if, I don't have exact numbers in front of me, but we've certainly talked about it, is that when a West Hartford student, K through 5, goes into a private school after that, they're typically 1 year behind. I shouldn't say, just not the opposite, just the opposite. I'm sorry, 1 year ahead. And when we see the private schools come to West Hartford, sorry, I really did confuse that. When we see the private schools come to West Hartford and join us, say, in 6th, 7th grade, or even high school, we find that they're often behind in math and reading. So the grass is not always greener on the other side in those educational scenarios, so.
I think for me, one of the things, and thank you for all the information, it's great, Chip. I think back to my personal experience when my children were at the old Charter Oak building and at Webster Hill. When at Webb Hill, we had to go through a spot redistricting where we pulled a couple of streets and sent those students over to Duffy. And it was a very painful experience, but it was something that had to be done. We were doing some things like that, and teachers using closets for offices and things of that nature. So at this point, you mentioned about the extremes. We're kind of getting some elbow room again, I think. We saw that at Sedgwick, the plans they have for the office space. Once the office moves downstairs, they're going to make good use of that space for teachers or staff offices as well. Are there any other examples?
I think I'm really glad you brought that up, Dave. It's a very good point that sometimes there's this perception that we're going off a cliff, we'll have all this space. Well, no, if you look at, we're just going back to where we were. I mean, we had the same number of schools then. I mean, when I started my career in West Hartford at Conard, we had, 1,500 less students than we do now. When I was first principal of Conard, I think there was 1,200 total students there. No, less. I think it was 07. So I don't think so. I think 1253, I believe. But it's one of those things where we're not, you're right, Dave, we're not seeing that cliff. And it goes to Mark's point also, 100 kids spread over 16 schools is 6 kids a school, 1 kid a grade or half a kid a grade. It does have that kind of difference. Sometimes you'll see a pocket where there is, well, we didn't plan. That school is where we had a bunch of move-ins. This school we had less. I will say that at Aiken, we were looking at the possibility of, we were looking at the garage area with the brick of how can we make it an office or something else where they park, their equipment, the snow blowers. What can we possibly do, because we were so full and we had no space. We couldn't move the kids, we couldn't move the street just because Norfelt was full. And so luckily didn't need it that year. And then the big 5th grade group that happened to be there moved on to King Philip, and that eased the space. Walcott, where the downstairs, we began calling the garden area, where we had the art room without a window, because that was where we had space and we had to go to. Now we've been able to go back up into regular classroom spaces. Those have opened up. We repurposed locker rooms at Duffy into classrooms. So it wasn't all portable classrooms. So we're trying to maybe repurpose into some of those things we used to have. And really, that Sedgwick, with the office space moving now, and we'll be, changing this over probably around the Martin Luther King weekend, we'll change the entryway. That's how it was designed. We just weren't able to use it that way because of space concerns and needing the extra eating space. So that's a very good example of how we use it. So good point. Thanks.
Kudos to all the efforts that were done over the years to make use of the space that we had. And as we get some more space available, I'm sure everyone appreciates it. And if you get a chance to see it, I think you'll really appreciate it.
Teachers fill space. If you give them space, it's filled quickly.
Hello again. Tag team question, actually. So again, from your report, you make reference to, with Charter Oak, gradually by 2021, roughly increasing its census to, population rather, to about 480. So that's going to be a high student-teacher classroom ratio, I believe. I'm just curious, my question then is, what is the preferred student-teacher ratio in a classroom?
So we, as a district, the board sets class size guidelines that we operate against. So there are maximum of 23 students in kindergarten through 3rd grade and 27 students in 4th and 5th grade. At Charter Oak and Smith, our 2 schools and our two magnet schools and our 2 most impacted schools, the guidelines are set at 22 in kindergarten through 3rd grade and 23 in 4th and 5th grade. Charter Oak, we're designing or hoping to have it roughly at 20 students per grade level. So there'll be 480 students split over 24 sections, 4 sections per grade in kindergarten through 5th grade is the target.
Thank you for clarifying. I was concerned the number was going to go up and the supports, so yes, thank you.
No, and it's interesting because at Charter Oak and Smith, we have a level of control more than any other place, which is why you see those numbers are always steady, because we can accept students, not accept students, to keep that number where it is. So, and Charter Oak has been a great success. And really, as we shifted our marketing with the opening of Charter Oak and increased the marketing of Smith, those have both attracted more and more students to Smith and Charter Oak, and really we're at an all-time high for magnet applications and placements at both of our schools. So it's been a great story, the building.
If I can just clarify, I'm not against, wonderful to have more population, the population to go up. I'm just thinking in terms of the attention in the classroom, and if there are lots of students and support staff and children getting their needs met. So that was the basis for my
When we designed Charter Oak, we specifically were targeting 4 sections per grade, 20 students per grade level, with enough smaller classroom spaces around there to provide the appropriate support services, speech, social workers, reading support, math support, all the things that go into a typical West Hartford school. We've made sure we had enough spaces for all of those things, plus the 5 pre-K classrooms, which are
I was just going to say, I know that you know this, but in general, the reason that the numbers are going up is that this is a slow expansion into what the new building can hold. Right, so it's planned to expand over time. It's not to stuff them into the same classrooms, but, I mean, I know that you know that, but for the public, wherever the camera is.
Yes, there are 3 or 4 extra classrooms this year, I think. Yeah, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and next year there'll be 2 extra classrooms, 4th and 5th, where there aren't 4 sections of 4th or 4 sections of 5th. There'll only be 3 sections of 4th and 5th. And so there's extra classrooms that aren't fully being utilized yet. So they're growing into the building as planned.
Good. Thank you so much. I think this is so fascinating. It's really our chance to really look forward. Thank you very much. And moving on to actually a question that had come up at the last budget season about what are our intervention services. We're going to have a presentation about K-8 literacy intervention from Kerry Jones and Ann McKernan.
Yes. Welcome, Ann and Kerry. Thank you. We did have this question come up, and it is always, one of the areas that you have seen an increase to base on that question is we did not used to have a reading specialist in every building. So that's one of the shifts that we've made over the past 10 years to look at really the science of reading, how we teach reading, how students read. It is actually a success area if you look at our reading and writing scores over time. We're in a good place, not always where we want to be. But then in the context of the budget last year, it did come up, well, should we need reading special at the high school, or should we reinvest in K-8, and how do we do this? So we took that at your request, and here they are.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. So this evening, we'd like to share some information. Some of it came up last year during budget season, and also because we have some new members to the board, we want to make sure that all of you have the information that you need regarding our literacy program. So tonight, our presentation will serve as an update on the program. Our goal is to provide you information on the structure of the program, explain who the program serves, who participates, who provides the services, and what the services really look like. So I'd like to start with this graphic, which kind of, I think is important for us because we have a good understanding, and the research is very clear that literacy is critical to overall student achievement from elementary school through high school into college and civic life. A student with limited reading capacity has many greater chances of either dropping out, not continuing in school, and having a lifelong impact on their wages. So if we look at our literacy continuum and look at the key points, we can see some of the key skills that need to be obtained at each level along the way. We look at our youngest students in our earliest years. Our primary focus for our K-3 students is to develop foundational literacy skills, 5 foundational literacy skills: the phonemic awareness, the sounds that you hear, the phonics, the sounds and the symbols of reading, the vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And this is a very key point, 3rd grade, as so much of the research points to. But it doesn't stop there, because there are other key gates that students need to continue to move through. And in that 4th to 5th grade upper elementary school level, students now have a purpose for reading. They're gathering information. They're understanding concepts through reading and ideas through reading. They're really engaging in a deeper level of reading and connecting their reading and writing regularly, and they serve to support each other. And then we move to the middle school, where the demands continue to increase, especially in content areas. Now students are in separate social studies and separate science with vocabulary that's specific to a discipline. And their texts are much richer and more complex. Their comprehension skills, their higher demand on their comprehension skills, and of course their vocabulary skills. And by high school, of course, our students are gaining a real depth of knowledge in discipline-specific areas. They're looking at information across multiple texts regularly, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating. And our program is designed to make sure that at every step of the way, our students are ready for those increasing demands that they're going to encounter. I'm going to turn over to Kerry for a second.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks all, and it's great to be here, and welcome new board members. I'm going to leave on this slide for a moment. I think there's often a conception that we're good by 3rd grade, that all children know how to read, can code the text, can understand and pick up a piece of text and understand what they're reading, can use their phonemic awareness and fluency skills to get through almost any text. And then the demands, as Ann mentioned, increase. And the reality is we have children who struggle at every grade. regardless of that prior experience. So they may, for example, be finding that the complexity of text as they enter the middle school level gets that much more increasingly demanding. The vocabulary, the level of demand of the actual text itself increases significantly. So the students may have difficulty with comprehending those texts, whereas in elementary school they may have looked like they could understand that level text just fine. They're taking many different content area classes at the same time. So the rigor, the demand of texts may, for some children, pose more of a problem in the middle and high school grades. We may have students who are learning a second language, and we know that that takes a period of time. So maybe now in fourth grade, they're suddenly ready to crack the code of English in terms of the reading. The oral language is set. The reading now needs to happen, and their fourth grade classroom may not be providing that foundational literacy skill set. So intervention can support those students as well. And lastly, we may have students who are new to district, who may have, and I know that's been a question that's been raised, children new to district, what impact do they have? And we find that candidly, it's about a third of our children who move into our district. We looked for a trend, and it was about a third of those students may or may not need reading intervention support, or maybe need something brief and enter and exit pretty quickly. We looked for data trends, and candidly, we could not point to one particular and Ann and I are both people who like to dig into data. We could not say it was one particular piece of evidence that said, why do we have children still needing intervention in seventh grade? They have the need, and we have criteria and evidence to support their needs and programs there to serve them. So that's where this SRBI diagram comes in. And all states have what's called a response to intervention approach to education. It means that we would anticipate that the majority of students in the green there would be achieving, about 80% of the kids would be achieving at grade level. However, some children may need some supplemental instruction, some short-term core foundational skills, core comprehension or fluency skills work. Some children may need support in writing as well in the upper grades. And that's intended to be small group, short-term, intensive kinds of supports. And that we anticipate being about 5 to 15% of students. And again, this is not just in Connecticut, across all states who have a response to intervention approach as we do. And lastly, there are some students who are not showing response. I think of this kind of like a medical model. We're going to try one course of treatment first. That's still not working. Let's go to a more intensive, supportive, maybe one-to-one or specialist kind of approach. In Connecticut, we call it scientific research-based interventions. We're not just using our gut to decide what children need. We're using a research base to make that determination. So we know there are programs that support fluency, that support foundational literacy, and we're putting those in place for students who are showing signs of difficulty all through the pre-K to high school continuum. And I also want to mention that these scientific research-based interventions are applicable not only in literacy, but in mathematics and in behavioral, social, emotional supports as well. So we have a similar type of model in place for those areas. So how do the students get identified? Again, it's a thoughtful, planful, systemic approach at all grades. One of the hallmarks of our SRBI system is a universal screening type of plan. So in kindergarten through 8th grade, we have a consistent universal screening measure called AIMS-WEB. It's a brief, under 45 minutes in total fall, winter, and spring measure at all grades, conducted by students, part online this year, which has been a nice approach with students. I think they found it to be a more engaging, perhaps, way to engage in this sort of universal screen. And some of it is done one-to-one with teachers, and particularly in fluency, so understanding their reading rates. And so that's a really critical piece that of information we look at, but we don't just look at that. We're certainly looking at their classroom performance, their other assessments, their state testing. So we look at really a portfolio of student achievement data and performance data to make a decision on whether or not they're actually struggling. There are students who may not do well in a screening assessment, for example, and are operating perfectly fine on grade level in the classroom. So that there's a variety of pieces of information we're looking at a regular 3 times a year basis. So, I think the question came up last year, what if someone moved in new to our district in November? What happens? We know by January we'll have a universal screen in place. They have a few months to acclimate, and then we'll have that measure in place to just double check and make sure they're doing okay. We also have a process called student success teams. It's a process in place in every school where a group of reading specialists, literacy specialists, school psychologists, classroom teachers, administrators meet on a regular basis and review this data. So they may start first in a grade level team and then bring it to a smaller team to make a decision. They may, at the elementary level, we tend to have more of a regular meeting, either weekly or on a cyclical basis, to decide, are there students who could benefit from intervention or could benefit from exiting intervention? I think that's really important to note as well. And if students aren't responding, so back to that triangle, the students at Tier 2 who are not responding, we do engage in diagnostic assessments. So our literacy specialists at K-8 would engage students in a battery of literacy-oriented assessments to pinpoint, like in that medical model, to target what the intervention should be for that student. And this is a cyclical process, so when students are engaged in literacy intervention, they're not in there languishing forever. There is an opportunity every 6 to 8 weeks to look at their progress. So those literacy specialists, tutors, interventionists providing the intervention to students progress monitor regularly. So how are the students responding to that intervention? We have regular progress monitoring probes and data, and that information helps us decide, is the intervention working or not? Do we need to change the intervention? Do we need to change the interventionist? Do we need to change the frequency, the duration, the amount of time a student is receiving the intervention? And the folks who provide the interventions are a variety of staff members, and at the elementary level, we have actually at K-8, we have reading specialists engaged in that work. There are people who are certified as reading interventionists in remedial reading with a 102 certification, or are reading consultants, an 097, the next step. So all of our reading specialists in every building are certified people who are trained in assessment, trained in the programming for those students. We also have early intervention teachers at the elementary level who have specialized training, master's degrees, graduate work in reading interventions, particularly in early intervention at the primary grades, but they do work with children at all grades. We also have literacy tutors who are all certified teachers working at the elementary level with students. As you'll see in a moment, our data for elementary would support the need for early intervention. We know the research base is we want to intervene as soon as possible, so we have that well-qualified group of people to do so. At middle school, we have literacy reading specialists working with students exclusively. And as you'll see, the numbers would support that. So as Ann and I looked at data, we had lots of data to review, and we decided probably the best way to look at it is to think about a cohort of students. So I'll look at elementary, and we'll talk about the middle school group, but this is the current third grade cohort of students, so the current third graders, and it shows their history since kindergarten. So you'll notice that, and then in the numeric numbers in the bars are the numbers of children. So the current third grade cohort has 48 children engaged in small Tier 2 group intervention across our elementary schools. And we have 14 children who are receiving more intensive Tier 3 or probably 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 type of intervention, more likely 4 to 5 days a week versus 3 to 4 days a week. So that's about 9% of our student population, well within our SRBI at 5 to 15% of students in third grade. You'll notice that same group of children, when they entered in kindergarten, we had a group of about 55 that required early intervention and in that kindergarten level. And with those foundational skills, we found they got those foundational skills, but now in first grade, the demand for reading, it's not just letter names and letter sounds, it's putting that together into text. So that's a very typical number we've seen. We looked at the trends over the last 5 years. It's been as high as 20%, it's been as low as 14%. So for this particular cohort, about 16% of children in first grade benefited from intervention. But you'll notice it worked. So for the same cohort of children, by second grade, only 10% did. And then only that 8.8% in third grade now. So the data shows that with that intervention, that intensive intervention in the early grades, it does help many of our children, but we still have roughly 8 to 10% of children who need that intervention service for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And Ann will talk about the current middle school cohort.
There you go. So we thought it might be helpful for you to see the same type of information starting with a different cohort, an older cohort of students. So this is our current 7th grade students in this current year. And if we look back at their history over the last few years, in grade 4, you can see that we have about 7% of our students, almost 8% of our students in tier 2 and 3, but that will decrease through 5th grade. And then you might think, well, why does it bump up so much then for 6th? But two factors I think you can, somewhat from Chip Ward's presentation, there's a great turnover at that 5th to 6th grade point. So that's a very big key. We want to get children in, understand where they are, and provide them services. And also with our previous slide about the demands increasing so much between 5th and 6th grade, now you're in separate classes. You have discipline-specific vocabulary that's getting much more rigorous, and the lexile levels of your readings are going up. There's less focus on your reading with support. Now you're reading almost completely independently. So it does bump up in 6th, but as you can see, it begins to tail off again. This actually, Paul and I had a chance to look at this cohort's Smarter Balance data, and we saw the exact same trends in reading. This group in 5th grade, there was 13% of the children in the lowest reading band. In 5th grade, in 6th grade, it grew up to about 17, and then it went back down to 11. So we're seeing, some of the jump between 5th and 6th probably being a harder gate to get through, a different model, a lot more independence. But with the right supports, we see that number coming back down. And Kerry has been in this work longer and at more depth level than at a deeper level than I have, and she says she's seen these trends for, this is not just a 1 year. This is not just a one shot, even though we see the same trend. So we feel the longer we have children, the greater impact we can have, resulting in fewer children needing intervention, and then students, but always being prepared for students to come through gates that are harder, more challenging for them, so we can provide the right support so they're back on the path to independence. So just a little summary, we wanted to give you a description of the program because we do have some new board members. We want to be clear about where our resources are and what kinds of programming, how we're thinking of the programming, give you an idea of how students cycle through. 85% of our students are not requiring this type of intervention, but for the 15% or less that are, we have a very planful program for them that results in fewer students, if they're with us, fewer students needing that intervention over time.
Special ed, pardon?
I'm sorry?
Sure. Another important point to mention is that in order for a student, for us to potentially make a referral to special education, we are required to go through an RTI, a response to intervention process. So we've got to demonstrate that we have put into place a quality tier 1 program, so right in the classroom, that we've put into place interventions that are research-based, and that we have the data and the progress monitoring to show that the student still isn't responding to those high-quality interventions. We may need to take another look and determine if a student does have some sort of a reading disability or other disability which would impact their reading capabilities. So I think it's important to note that this is not a nice to have. This is a critical piece to our process for potential referral for special education services.
Thank you. Questions? This time starting from this end. Deb?
Thank you very much for this report. I think reading is so important, and I know there are data out there indicating that you could actually project a community's future prison population based on how many children can read by grade 3. I was thinking a little bit about the high school level, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how students at the high school level are identified. I think that it's so fragmented. They have many different teachers who may or may not communicate with each other about each student. And as you mentioned, going through the gate for 6th grade, and you think about the content level of the texts that students are reading at the high schools, I'd be interested to know how students are identified and what sorts of programming are available. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and it's a good question because as we say, there's gates all along the way that students' abilities have to continue to improve in order to be successful. So the model will be similar in that you would see in an elementary school, and we actually give we've given the Ames Web screener through 8th, and we're giving the Gates McGinnity screener 9th and 10th, which keeps the students with that, we are able to see who's having reading difficulties. And so the delivery model is very similar in that there's screeners, there are tier 2 and 3 supports, tier 2 being less frequent, the small group is not quite as small, and then the tier 3 being even more intense. So it's a very similar model all the way through. Kerry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and at times we have looked at a model where the interventionist might do some of the time a push-in model into the high school classroom to get familiar with the demands, where the students are with those demands, and then be able to have a seminar type of model. So really almost exemplarize almost more of a college type model where you might have that support person in the class with you part of the time, is aware of what's going on, where the difficulties are, again, because of that fragmentation, and then be able to do a seminar model where the interventions are able to be implemented with the students on that small group basis.
If I could, just on the high school note, one of the things that you see that's a little bit different with the reading special at the high school, and you can speak to this more, I shouldn't say a little bit different. You may see it more of that reading specialist also working with staff members to understand in a professional development sense how we can work with kids. Here are the areas this child's having, decoding difficult nonfiction, science. I mean, that you'd see it more. They're exposed to something they haven't been exposed to before. Okay, so working with our own staff on how to work through that. Oftentimes, if we're identifying somebody new at high school, it's most likely somebody that moved in. I mean, it's very exceptionally rare that it's somebody that we haven't identified previously that's come up within our system. I don't know if there's anything else, and just in terms of how it looks different.
I think you've both done a really good job of explaining that the high school student and all of the reading specialists really do work with the staff, and we probably didn't highlight that enough. Not only are they working directly with the students, but they are working with the staff. And at the high school, I think at the older levels, having the teachers sometimes push into the classroom is extremely helpful because the students get the support right there and don't lose a period or any time that they may need for something else. So that very good, important addition to that. But the direct support these folks give to the classroom teacher is invaluable because teachers learn quite a bit about how to chunk reading, how to support reading, and can identify which students need that extra in-class support. Because remember, they're all getting Tier 1 support as well, and so their teachers have to be aware of what's best for them.
Before you go on, I don't know if you have any more questions, but I wanted to follow up on that because I had similar questions. So I understand that in the elementary and the middle schools, then the kids are, if they're pulled out either during that class or so. How does it work in the high school, or maybe how does it work in all the schools? When are the kids pulled out? What time? What else are they missing? How does that work?
At the K-5 level, we have slightly different structures. The schedules are very different. So at K-5, the students there are times when we may push in, particularly at kindergarten, maybe some at first grade. We find, by the time you're walking, because you're literally picking up the children, walking them down, and depending where the interventionist classroom is. So there are plenty of times that the interventionist may push in. But if a student is receiving particularly a Tier 3 intervention, a one-to-one, or that Tier 2 small group, working in that reading specialist classroom, it's focused, the materials are there. We will typically avoid a math class. We will avoid the full literacy class. It may be the tail end. They've had their small group time with their classroom teacher, and then maybe the tail end, maybe it's an independent reading time or another station type activity that they may have time in. The reading interventionists are incredibly creative about finding times that are least disruptive to the student's overall experience, and really look at each individual child and what they need. So if first thing in the morning is great for that child, let's do it. If right after lunch works well because it's a tough transition in the classroom, we'll get them right out of, after lunch. So really there's an individualized plan for each group of students, and we try to avoid as much other academic time or have a rotating schedule. So maybe it's 12:30 on this day and 2:30 on this day, so we're not consistently missing the same science class or whatever it is. It's a challenge for us, no question.
You've hit on a question that is something I wrestle with. We all discuss, Paul, and that is, especially as you go, it's what are they going to miss? Because they need this reading support. Frankly, you can make an argument that through middle school, there should be reading time set aside every day for all students. But we have a finite number of hours in that day. And to say, okay, you're going to miss social studies, or you're going to be pulled out of world language, or you're going to be pulled out of unified arts, or we're going to cut unified arts and replace it with that reading. Those are all the questions that become really difficult because, especially in West Hartford, and I say this with love, we want everything for our kids. And we don't like choices when when one of the choices is not to do something. And that's something, it's both a policy, it's a curricular question. I think really it hits the middle level most directly.
The staff we have at elementary, that flexibility of some of those part-time tutors and other staff, we're typically able to work it out to a point where we don't feel like it's a detriment to the students' other core academics. At middle school, though, we restructured a few years ago from a social studies-based model to a true intervention model, and challenges.
Right, so everyone's exactly on point, and nobody likes anyone to miss anything, but it would not be odd if you walked into a middle school in Connecticut, in another town, where they might have a double block ELA situation through middle school, or at least through 6th grade. So we have to make choices, and our Tier 2 students are often taking out of one rotation of their specials and hoping that 6 to 8 week time frame can provide the support and skills that the child can use independently. That could be repeated again if that one cycle wasn't a strong enough dosage of intervention. Our Tier 3 students are typically going to be taken out of world language and then start that study in the high school. So it's a difficult choice no matter what students are missing. And if students have additional needs such as English language learning, you can see other impacts. But I can assure you that the team does their very best to keep the child in mind and what can we do for them given the constraint of time and the schedule of its nature. But with the numbers that we're seeing in the percentages, they're well within the range of the response to intervention model, which is a national model, the Connecticut models, which is built on that. So although it does occur that children do miss things, people are very cognizant that we'd like them to have the full range of all the specials and world language and everything else that we can provide.
And high school?
The high school is scheduled a little differently. They don't have a rotation to pull out of they can be scheduled into an individual class. So it's a little bit different.
You mean scheduled into
an section?
Right. You mean scheduled into the existing class that they're helping in, or do you mean in like a study hall period?
Both. Yeah. Both. Yes.
Thank you.
But, yes, but think about, I understand the impact of taking them out of class, but the reading instruction will teach them for hopefully life. And think about the education they're missing by not being able to comprehend and understand. So you really have to build the foundation first, in my mind. So if they're missing social studies, I'm almost okay with that, because how do they understand social studies if they can't comprehend, retain?
Being there isn't going to help if they can't.
So it's I know it's a double-edged sword, but the benefits outweigh the cost of missing that class.
Oh, absolutely. Although it does sound like you're, to the best that you can, trying to get everything in there, which is great. No, absolutely, though. What's the point of being in these classes if you can't actually absorb them? Thank you. Questions from Lisa?
A complicating factor along that line, I'm sorry, is that it's not unique that a child struggling with reading, and it goes to your point, Mark, and it's really, if you struggle with reading, you're probably struggling in more areas than just reading. So it's not just the reading support, and then it's the extra math support, and that's where, you have that balance of trying to catch kids up while monitoring them at the same time. So it's a struggle. There's no panacea to it.
Excellent points, because I was going to bring that up. But Ann and Kerry, I want to thank you for the presentation, because it's very excellent in terms of how you're presenting and great for the listening audience. I have a couple of questions. One that Mark sort of touched upon in terms of the comprehension piece. I know reading can be very difficult, especially for that small percentage of kids who may not even want to admit that there's an issue, especially in the high school area, where they don't want to look like the odd man out. And I know that carries over, especially when they go on and are accepted in college, so it still becomes a weakness. So my question is, and you have great tools in place, especially how you track the progress. But my question is, in terms of the reading and the comprehension, what, one, how do you measure not so much the improvement? So how do you measure the improvement over a period of time? And especially as they transition from elementary to middle to high school, because I know the reading specialists are key and I give them kudos. But what I still see students struggle with is they still haven't mastered that reading to comprehend the more difficult material that they receive as they advance. And they may just get by. And what I'd like to see is that mastery level for this small percentage of students where they've mastered it to the point where they're confident in reading and comprehending the information, especially as it gets more difficult.
I'll start, and Ann, we're back and forth here. First of all, to address the not letting a child, I'm hearing, almost slip through the cracks, like making sure we're on it. It's been critical for us to think, and Chris Nystrom's in our audience as our secondary literacy department supervisor, and we've worked diligently to think particularly about that 5 to 6 transition, which is so critical, and that's why we put into place this year a universal screening measure that is the same from grades 2 through 8. So there's a specific comprehension measure. We can look at growth, and actually we're not just looking at achievement, we're looking at both. We're looking at the rate of achievement, and we're also looking at, their achievement levels as well as the rate of achievement. So that having a consistent measure across those grades has been critical. It doesn't go beyond 8th grade, so that's why we have a different measure in 9th and 10th. So number one, I think having that consistent screening measure we're using regularly throughout the grades is a help. And in fact, we're engaging in training, ongoing training with all of our staff, including our special educators tomorrow. So that's been an important piece. We had different measures in place in the past, and they didn't always talk to each other. So consistency of measure allows us to track over time, and we can see where the peaks and falls of growth are. Secondly, it's professional learning. So as was alluded to by Tom and Ann as well, that professional learning continues. It's continuous. We're continuously thinking about in our content areas, how are we bridging those pieces? We just met with our science department supervisors last week, and we were talking about vocabulary strategies and what are we doing across the continuum, K-12, to make sure that it's not just about the content of science, it's how we're teaching thinking skills and strategies for language use in content areas. So professional learning and our vertical teams, our curricular teams that cut across K-12, and then how does science align with language arts, align with social studies, align with mathematics, align with the other content areas in terms of the kinds of strategies kids need to comprehend. And it's not just up to the English teachers to solve that we're really thinking about critical literacy skills across all the areas. So ongoing PD, ongoing conversation across the grades, I think and across content areas is the key. And I don't know if you
I think the only piece that might help the discussion is I think we're also getting quite a lot better every year at looking at our data and what it's telling us and where to pinpoint. For instance, in this newest assessment, we have a very good understanding of our students, and they're given national percentile ranks. So we can see with this new data where the child actually falls across a nation of students in the 5th grade. And we can target more specifically the better we use our data. Just this year, so that's just one example. I think we're getting better at using it, better at targeting kids and providing the right dosages of intervention as we get better, as we go on. We recently were able to look more closely even on our state testing results and find areas where we saw weaknesses that we hadn't had before. So we're hopefully we're spending time with our principals, our leaders, and our teachers to really be using this information because there's not more time in a day, and there's not, we hesitate to pull students out of anything that we don't absolutely need to. So to continue to work as smart with the data as possible, and then build their success too. because I'm a big believer in success breeds success. When students they think they can do something, they have that chance to continue to do that, to excel and to persevere in that effort. And as Kerry mentioned, our professional learning program is crucial here. All kids are in Tier 1. Everyone's in Tier 1. You don't miss that. So if we can continue to improve what's happening there, we affect everyone without additional pullouts. So it's a multi-pronged approach of using good screeners, looking closely at that data, providing the right professional learning, being very careful of what they're missing, also trying to develop some enjoyment and love for, for reading, but as well as showing that they can be successful here. And I think that will continue to lead us down a very good path. I'm really encouraged actually by the numbers of students and the percentage of students who are in there. There are many districts who are working with 20-25% of their students needing these kinds of tiered interventions. And because of the strength of the program, I think we can keep most of our kids from having to do that and staying in their Tier 1, getting most of their support out of Tier 1.
If I follow up, hold on. I'm glad you mentioned the love of reading, because I was going to go there and ask, especially in the elementary grade level, about support material for home, and if the parents or guardians are involved in reinforcing some of that reading support that they're receiving in the small group sessions in school.
So it gets to the idea of transfer, and I was thinking about the child at the center, and to what degree is the child transferring what they're learning in that intervention classroom to either their home setting or their classroom setting? Can they come home and say, we learned this great strategy today, or I was learning how to do this kind of letter formation, or whatever it is. So the homeschool communication is critical. I think as many times in elementary schools, there's more regular and frequent communication at the early grades, especially if children are getting intensive intervention. So it could be a journal, it could be a weekly note, it might be a phone call home. Each reading specialist knows their child and the family with whom they're working, and what's the best communication strategy. One strategy doesn't work best for every family and every child. So there's regular homeschool communication. The reading interventionists attend parent conferences. Parents are often invited in for those student success team meetings if needed, particularly if a student's moving to Tier 3 in a more intensive intervention. So the communication with home is critical, and that idea of students bringing home I'm thinking about the first graders I was with the other day. They have their little book baggie, and that goes back and forth, and so there's the idea of independence. I'm taking pride in this. My homework is to bring my book home and read it to somebody at home, or family member, or friend. So it's building in the independence and the transfer for children along with that excitement. So at the middle school level, certainly, as with any middle school class, there's communication, but I'll let Ann.
The point I was going to add was I've seen so many creative things that teachers do to spark the love of learning. Chris Nystrom just sent me an email, and I think it was unprompted too. It was from a set of teachers who were committed to showing the students how all the authentic things they can do with writing, all the different contests they can participate in, all the different opportunities there are to showcase their literacy skills. And it was a pretty impressive list. I'll have to share it with Tom and share it with the board, because those I think our teachers are quite creative in the ways that they are communicating the importance to love literature, that it's important for all the life skills, and that there's really unique opportunities to do things with it. I'm always impressed. I have an elementary school child who looks forward. Today was a big book buddy reading day in elementary school. I'm sure you've heard of the book buddies. So if you really look around, it's hard to point to one or two because it's everywhere. It's book
Family
buddies, and
literacy
it's family literacy nights, and it's books going home, and it's authentic writing contests or reading poetry. And I think our teachers are quite creative in their efforts to, let children really experience all of the great joys around literacy, as well as tuck all those extra supports in where they need it. And I wish I had a presentation of all those extra things they do, but they're not hard to find. They're actually quite easy to find on the websites and the letters home. to parents of all that is going on. Even in my middle schoolers' homework, I'll see so many creative kinds of assignments, and I know a big part of that is just to get the engagement. And so I think you'd be proud. I wish I had more examples with me tonight.
Smith has a grill where they're serving up hot books. So there are all kinds of creative ways that each school has its own culture and flavor, but it's definitely critical to inspire that love of learning.
If I could just jump in on your question, which I think is really important. I know this is very early on in the process of developing this, but I do remember from the testing scores that we were starting to see some closing in certain achievement gaps. And I just wonder, because that's a way to tell if these interventions are actually working or not. And so I wonder, are you seeing any, is it too early to tell, or are you seeing any potential closing of some gaps there?
I don't have it fresh in my head this minute, so I feel
Didn't mean specific numbers, but
I like to keep a lot of numbers in my head, so I apologize. But I'd like to get back to you on that, because I want to say yes, but I can't cite it right now, so I apologize.
So I'll challenge you to see if you have this number in your head. Thinking about the number of reading specialists and interventionists that we have compared to the number of students who are needing the help, would you say that there is an appropriate caseload for each of these professionals right now? Do we need more of them? What would be your opinion about the caseload for each of them?
I think that's a great question, because we're talking about the students, we're not talking about the supports there. And I don't know how you'd feel when I said there's only 2 high school people who are doing the majority of all this high school work. So we are not at all overburdened at the high school level. In the middle school, I believe there are 7.
7, including Kelly.
7 across our 3 middle schools, and 1 is partial supervisor of the program, so she's not always directly working with children. So that number is not a very big number at all, and they're making some really good impacts. And I'll let Kerry talk about elementary.
Elementary, we have closer to 30 staff. Again, some are part-time tutors, part-time certified teachers who are tutors 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, depending on the school. Each school has a full-time reading specialist, which was a critical role to have in place at every school, and we were able to back off a little bit on some of our early intervention teachers. Their caseloads vary depending, again, on their hours and the size of their school. So some schools have 250 children, but perhaps closer to 20% of children in intervention at a certain grade. And so it really varies depending on the children's needs. But I'd say the caseloads at elementary are, they would say there's always more to do. There's always more work to do at Tier 1 with classroom teachers. The majority of the time is still spent with students. There is support of each reading specialist at elementary to the building principal, curriculum specialists, classroom teachers for professional learning, but we're maxed out. We've moved staff around, so in one school, really didn't need a tutor anymore. I moved that tutor to a school where they needed it. So staffing will ebb and flow at a tutor level, depending on the level of children's need, and making sure that schedule works for children on a daily basis. So they're adequate, but...
And that tutor, and I think that's, we use our title funds on our tutoring. Our tutoring is one of the best bang for the buck, because we do have a significant number of teachers that live in town that maybe can't take a full teaching load, but 15 hours a week, 20 hours a week, and going in the schools and working with those kids during interventions. Our tutoring program is really a godsend. So we've seen increase in that when need. It's one of those things that we try not to wait. If we need somebody, we add it year to year. So there's not a set number, because that's out of a separate line item in the budget.
I'm always curious what processes or mechanisms we have in place to ensure that these meetings, these processes are applied uniformly throughout all the schools in the district. Universal screening, by definition, it should be universal. SSTs and maybe even RTIs. Can you tell us how we make sure that what happens at Norfelt is the same thing that happens at Wolcott, for example?
I'm the supervisor of all of them, and I attend all their meetings. So but truly, I think it is helpful to have centralized, and Chris is the supervisor of the 612 staff. We each have a teacher leader who supports us that work, so troubleshoots, make sure that the paperwork's in place, troubleshoots the data for us. So at a global level, Chris and I have immediate supervision authority, I guess I will say. Okay. And so we're there, and I specifically go to SST meetings at every school each year, observe teachers, observe the process, and we have regular monthly meetings with our reading specialists, both at all levels, in terms of talking about a process. What's working here, not here? What do we need to shift to make things more efficient so that teachers aren't out of the classroom from their students for these kinds of meetings, that our universal screening measures are done appropriately. So many of our town-wide staff, our curriculum specialists, will go and help do some of the tests with teachers side by side to make sure that we're implementing them with fidelity and in the appropriate spirit and systemic nature. So, there are definitely spot checks. I'll just stop by meetings. I have their schedule, so I
love it. Thanks for that. And I'm just curious, what do we have in place to make sure there are a lot of players that should be at an SST, for example, and scheduling is always a challenge. Is there a certain minimum number of staff that you look to have there? If somebody can't make it, do you reschedule it? But that's tough if a parent has taken time off of work to come in for this. How do you work around those types of challenges?
So each school schedules their own meeting schedule, because some have part-time staff like psychologists, some may have full-time staff in place. So each school has that autonomy to schedule their meetings as best fit their staffing needs. So at some schools, as I said, it's become a more cyclical meeting. Let's meet every 6 weeks, or based on that benchmark data. Other schools, based on the numbers of children, need to meet every single week. It's just they have a number of children, they may have math needs, they may have behavioral needs as well. So schools have autonomy in that they just are required through our SRBI state mandate to meet regularly, and the players involved really depend on the child's need. So a school psychologist may or may not have to be at every single meeting, depending if it's a straight literacy need, tier 2, that may or may not be a critical player to have at the table. However, if there are behavioral issues at play, we see some math issues as well. The student may be moving to a more intensive, isn't responding to intervention. We'd want to make sure to have a speech and language pathologist, maybe a psychologist at the table. Certainly building administrators, curriculum specialists, and reading specialists are all there. So it really depends on where the child is, how they're responding to intervention. But the core team is the curriculum specialist, the reading specialist, the school principal, and ideally a psychologist, depending on the nature of the needs of the child. And speech and language we bring in as we can.
That's fine. I think you really got my question there. The core team, is the classroom teacher also part of that group?
Yeah, I'm assuming that, yes, absolutely.
Perfect.
The classroom teacher would attend those meetings. And that's where each school needs to schedule appropriately. It depends on their coverage schedule. As for some schools, it works best before school. Other schools during the day, so that they have that autonomy, but certainly their meeting notes are kept. We have a consistent documentation system we're using at the middle school level and 5th grade on for that continuity, using our data management system to track so that any party who's involved in this with the student's educational experience can see what interventions are in place. At the younger grades, we have a handle on that. It's one classroom teacher, but in the upper grades, we're using our data management system to track so that you're a science teacher, you can see what happened at the last meeting, what are the interventions, what's in place. So we have some data systems to help us as well.
That's great. Thank you both.
It seems to me, by the way, that that's another reason that, going back to our discussion last meeting or the meeting before about teams, that the team meeting time where you can talk about students is a perfect opportunity for that kind of conversation. It just struck me that was another advantage. Anyway, Lorna?
As well, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a comment and a question. My comment is, Carol, thank you so much for raising your question. I was going to ask the same exact thing in terms of how you involve the family dynamics with reinforcing the work that's done. My question is, recognizing that for young people, or any person at that, they'll be more motivated to learn to read if they're reading of subject matters or things that are of interest to them. So how, in terms of your reading materials, how are they diverse in terms of subject matters and characters and things of that sort to help to appeal to the young people?
Great question, and you'll be pleased to know that we continue to get requests from our principals. This year, I've heard several to continue to look at the diversity of the books in the classroom library so that we are representing all children in a variety of choices, and we continue to work with them to figure through the various budget avenues to make sure that that need is met. So just this year, I think we've had 2 or 3 requests about let's continue to look at what we have in the classroom library. So when kids are choosing books to take home, they have a wide variety of choices, different reading levels, as well as different representations of people around the world. In terms of classroom, this is tier 1 work I'm talking about right now. In terms of tier 1, the teachers are regularly talking about, what are the engaging novels, what are the engaging short stories, and what meets the middle school mind, because students will read much more when they love what they see and are naturally interested in it. And a continued work will be to have children have choice in their reading, and then have some anchor texts that they're all reading together that are highly interesting, so you can teach certain aspects of reading through the anchor. But when children go off to read on their own, they have the knowledge from the anchor text so they can apply to their individual reading. So teachers work hard to promote independent reading of choice novels that are at the right levels and that are of high interest, as well as choose texts that are going to be generally interesting to, I want to say, the middle school child is where that often happens.
I think one of the things, Lauren, if I could jump in too, that's a hallmark of West Hartford, because we don't want it to be, well, it's December, it's the first week, you must be reading Ethan Frome, just like I did when I was there. God, I hated Ethan Frome. But the idea being, because of our 5-year curriculum review cycle, where we're always reviewing our curriculum and presenting with each other as part of our, just as part of what we do and how we review our curriculum, we are continuously asking that question about what texts are getting to kids, what isn't getting to kids, and it can be so many different aspects, from gender, nonfiction versus fiction. How does that grab different people, and so how do we work with that, and how do we involve choice in that process so that the children can find avenues for books that speak to them? So I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks.
Just on the public library too, so it's not a matter of cost for these parents. It's even in the elementary, it's set up very, very well, by grade level, by reading level, and by topic. It's really set up where a kid could go in there and look at the books from this point to this point and up, and it's actually really well done in our public libraries as well. And the schools actually support that, and I think the teachers work with the libraries. Correct me if I'm wrong. And even in the middle school, it's set up very well.
I was actually going to go to the same point, but talking about the school librarians, because not only have the teachers been continuously seeking and getting and adding to their classroom libraries where students could come and, hey, can I borrow this book? And the teachers loan out books. But the librarians have equally been engaged in looking at their collections. There's a CIT, that's a collaborative inquiry team right now of librarians that are calling through their collections so that they can stay up to date on what they need. Are they representing the whole school body? Are there new titles that are coming out that are particularly engaging? And are they at different reading levels? So that work is ongoing, constant. We hear about it quite a bit, and we get good requests for continuing to expand and diversify our collections, whether they be classroom collections or school library collections.
Cheryl, if I could, one thing, just to put a bow on it, because I've been thinking about this during the whole presentation, and as we talk about everything, this is when we step back and think about our own education, because so often we think about, what was it like when I was in school, elementary school. This is a radical concept and shift in what we do in schools and how we intervene. These positions did not exist, and I'm not talking 40 years ago, I'm talking about 10 years ago. In a lot of our buildings, it was, where is it most needed? And that we realize reading's most needed. And the best example of that is, I can tell you 25 years ago, in my preparation to become a teacher, reading and teaching reading was not even hinted at for a high school teacher in terms of, it was just, you assign the book, read chapter 1, and there's the questions at the end. And if the kids didn't do it, well, you're marked off because you didn't do your homework. There wasn't a thought about the science of reading. I mean, this is a field that has grown dramatically, and I think we're seeing benefits from that. Our kids do write dramatically better than they did in the 90s. Every metric says that, and I use the 90s because that's when I was starting off, and I know what the numbers were and what they are now. So,
Thank you so much. That was great conversation. That's right. And a very nice bow. That's right. Just in time for the holidays. Thank you. And now the personnel report by Mr. Rick Ledwith.
Good evening, everyone. Personnel report can be found on page 17 of your board packet. And for our 3 new board members, I thought I'd take a moment to summarize the purpose of our personnel report. So district policy requires administration to report any changes in certified staffing that occur throughout the school year. So when we hire a teacher or administrator, when a teacher or administrator resigns or retires, or if we approve a leave of absence for a certified teacher, we're required to report that to you as it happens throughout the school year. So you can see in this month's report, we hired 5 new interim teachers since our last report. And an interim teacher, for the purpose of our new board members, is a teacher that we hire for a duration of anywhere from 40 days to an entire school year. And an interim teacher typically will fill in for someone who's out on a leave of absence. So for example, if we have a teacher who's on a maternity leave, we'll hire an interim teacher to replace that person either for an 12-week time period or for the entire school year. We typically hire around 30 to 40 interim teachers a school year. Also in this report, you can see we do have 2 retirements, 2 mid-year retirements. I highlight that because that generally does not happen. Most certified staff will retire at the end of the school year. So it's been a while since we've seen a mid-year retirement. This year we have 2. Speaking of normal retirements, we will report out to the board all of our retirements towards the end of the school year in one of our final personnel reports. But this year we have 5 reported retirements already for the end of the school year, which is a little bit high for this time of year. So I suspect we'll have a busier than normal recruitment season this spring and late winter and spring. So we'll report out to you as those numbers change as we move through the school year. And we'll also report out to you all the teacher career fairs that we'll be attending to help us recruit new teachers to West Hartford as we move through the school year as well. So in terms of administrator recruitments, we do, some of you may be aware that Assistant Principal John Guidry over at Hall High School has been promoted to a principal at Ellington High School. So we are unfortunately losing John Guidry to Ellington High School. That'll be effective July 1st of 2018. So John actually will fulfill his school year requirements here in West Hartford and then move to Ellington in July. And as many of you do know, John has been an outstanding teacher and an even better instructional leader in West Hartford since 2009 and has had a significantly positive impact on thousands of kids, teachers, and the parent community at large as well. So he will be missed, but we will start that recruitment process in January, and we should have that position filled by sometime in March, but we'll keep the board up to date as we move through that process through the winter. And that summarizes this month's report. Be happy to answer any questions that the board had. Good.
You've answered all our questions already, so
all right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Scintillating as always, Rick.
Absolutely. It's good to know. And now that was scintillating because now we move to routine matters. I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the Board of Education meeting of December 5th, 2017.
So moved.
Second. Any discussion, changes? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? So moved. Okay, board members, communications, reports, comments, stuff you did. It's all good. Okay. Other information. Okay. Now the evening is really coming alive. The report from the student board representatives.
Okay, so tomorrow we have our winter concert at 7 p.m. in the Conard Auditorium, and then we also have during the Wednesday school day, senior citizens are coming in and watching the choirs and the orchestras and the band. We also, as Mr. Moore noted, we had Human Rights Day last week at Conard, and we had a really outside of the box approach to it, and we had a 90-minute red zone, and we had student moderators be the leaders in the classroom. I was one of them. It was a really great experience. So we're looking at feedback from both the students and the teachers to see how can we improve it and advance it for next year and years to come. HOCO was very good. The weather cooperated. And we started off the basketball season for both girls and boys with wins. And everyone's excited for winter break. So thank you.
For this old guy, HOCO is homecoming?
Yes.
All right, just making sure.
Thank you. Hey, can you remind us, we touched on it briefly, deliberation versus debate on Human Rights Day, please.
Yeah, so I was actually trained my sophomore year. I went to UConn, and they taught me how to be a moderator. So basically what deliberation is how to, more of a collaborative and like an effort to hear other people's opinions and have open minds and everybody to talk and talk about their background in certain subjects besides rather than as if it was a debate, people would be arguing, and you know what I'm saying? So it was more of a, I would say that last Wednesday, it was hard for the students because they're so used to debating and arguing about their opinions on especially the 21st century mission for public schools. That was the topic. So it was hard, but so as the moderator, I'm supposed to be neutral and say, what do you think about this? Please don't argue. So it was interesting, but so deliberation, we had to teach them what it was. And I think it's really beneficial to the school that we did that last week. And it helps people learn about other people's experiences and their backgrounds and what they think, and opens people's minds to other point of views. So yeah, it's special.
It's a great idea because if I understand it, it means not just which side is right, but can we together come and create something entirely new? Yes. It's a lovely model. That's really great.
I'd also want to mention, while you're on the topic, Computer Science Day. I don't know if you went by
last week?
Last week, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So we had the fair we had during the day, and it was awesome because every single math class got to come in. I don't know how that happened, but every single math class took the day off and came in and walked around the fair. So I was really happy because, as I said last week, I have AP Calc first period. Didn't get to listen to my teacher talk about calculus, but everybody was, there was a bunch of students involved, and they had big poster boards, and they got to present about, there was robotics, and there was STEM initiatives and that kind of stuff, and volunteering with elementary school age children about how to get the little kids more involved in the STEM. So it was a good thing.
That's great. Thank you.
Hall's Helping Hands is teaming up with the West Hartford Public Libraries to collect and donate kindness kits for the West Hartford Food Pantry. So you can bring personal hygiene products to West Hartford Libraries, any of the branches, and also Hall is collecting them, and I'm not sure if Conard is, but I think that we might be in cahoots with Conard right now. This Saturday at 11 a.m. there's a free self-defense class for girls at Hall, but it's also open to any women in the community who would like to go. It's at the Underdogs Mixed Martial Arts Center, and you can see the Hall website for more details. Last week was Human Rights Week at Hall, as Mr. Moore talked about, and this year Hall is further celebrating Human Rights Day in January, but this was a wonderful sneak peek as to how much the student body cares about this. There were student-run discussions about human rights every lunch period, every day, and the Human Rights Coalition sponsored a screening of the movie Girl Rising about women's rights to education, and they raised money, and it was really wonderful. I went to the movie, and I loved it. Then for sports, for the indoor track team, this past Saturday in New Haven, both girls and boys did great, and hall records for long jump and high jumps were broken, so that was a pretty big deal. They were the first games of the season, and Hall's student fan section, Blue Rain, came out to many of the first games, the girls' basketball game, boys' basketball game, the first hockey game, and it's exciting to see that this energy that we had at the fall, this momentum, is still continuing on into the winter season. And that's about it that's happening at Hall, and happy holidays to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This concludes the last meeting of 2017. The next meeting, for our announcement of future meeting dates, is on January 10th, which is a Wednesday. It's a board workshop at 7 p.m. It's not a meeting, it's right, it's a workshop. And it's room 400, which is upstairs and on the other side. So that's Wednesday, January 10th. And then the next regular Board of Education meeting is January 16th, which is a Tuesday. And that's the presentation of the CIP, all the, thank you, capital improvements. I was going to say the building stuff, you know. Exactly. Again, regularly at 7 o'clock. So Wednesday, the 10th, is the board workshop, and Tuesday, January 16th, is the regular meeting, both at 7 o'clock. Any request for future agenda items? Okay, any comments from visitors? Oh, please.
John Joyce, 170 South Main Street. So as you know, I've watched the board and have been here a lot. But I'm still confused about how the board knows about what happens in our schools. You know, how are you informed about sort of the inner workings, not just the positive things? I mean, the superintendent gives a wonderful, glowing report of the schools every meeting, but, you know, not all things happening in schools are wonderful. You know, how are you informed about some of the challenges that are going on? How are you updated? You know, when are you going to bring that to the public's attention, you know, and have open discussions? You know, it'd be nice to have maybe some parents that are struggling with their children learning how to read or finding a love of reading to come and talk about that. You know, maybe more important than maybe a celebration like you had earlier in the meeting. You know, I think that, you know, you have to bring people forward and make it inviting for them. And there are outstanding issues that are major. You know, now we're in the process of doing the lottery for Bristow, but how does that really work? And you know, Bristow's been in operation for over a decade now, but I've never heard a report about what the benefits to the town have been for having a school of that size compared to the other schools. You know, we have Charter Oak up and running, you know, primarily initiated by a racial imbalance in town. I would like to hear a report about what's happened with the racial imbalance. You know, is it better? Is it worse? You know, what's happening? You know, it's issues like that that I think need to come before the board and the town. And also, you know, we have climate surveys that come out once a year. I'd sort of like to know more often how the climate is in these schools, you know, maybe quarterly. And the same with disciplinary reports. You get that once a year at the end of the year, and, you know, we all disappear for summer and things go on. You know, what are kids dealing with? What are teachers dealing with? What are the administration dealing with? You know, I think that it would be very helpful to have that more public. You know, and with the time and money that goes into the is it CIS? You know, for the teachers, you know, their programming together. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that put into like a TED Talk format, and so the town could see that, the parents could see, okay, what are the specialists in our town doing and showing about how they're teaching and how they're improving. And it'd be great if you guys would be a little more active in getting the information that you ask for, you know, from the administration to the public. Oftentimes there are comments, you know, well, we'll get you that, and we'll get that information to the board. But how does it get to the public? You know, and also with your board packets, I think everything that isn't privileged should be on the table and on the website, so it's open. No, it's not. It's not. You know, it's selective. You know, but the public's entitled to all that information except for what's, you know, privileged, and that's not happening. I would really like to see that happen. And also maybe for the parents that are having a hard time coming to these meetings for their kids, could you do some teleconferencing so people, you know, wouldn't have to take a lot of time off from work and maybe get together that way, both for the professionals and for the parents as another option. I mean, business does it all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Since there's no executive session, then there remains only one thing to do, which is to wish everybody a very happy holiday and a happy new year filled with peace and quiet and rest. Thank you all. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I assume no opposition. We are adjourned.